Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, thank you, bonjour, thank you. Hello, joining us for this panel discussion titled Bringing Digital Acceleration to Science, the Road to Adopting Artificial Intelligence Systems in Science-Based Departments and Agencies. My name is Vic Pant. I'm the Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor at Natural Resources Canada, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion. In a moment, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists who will share a variety of views and bring a diversity of perspectives to bear on this topic, and really looking forward to this really thoughtful and thought-provoking exchange of ideas. I want to talk a little bit about myself as we get started. This is my second time at the CSPC. Last year, I participated in a panel discussion, and I also moderated a panel discussion. And we found that there was a lot of interest on this topic of digital acceleration and using data to make evidence-based decision making. So we thought that this year also it will be a great idea to bring thought leaders from the government and from outside the government together in this panel to really unpack some of these topics and get talking about this subject matter. I work at Natural Resources Canada, which is a science-based department. We have a number of storied institutions within the Natural Resources Canada family, many of which I know that audience members would have heard of, including but not limited to the Canadian Forest Service, the Geological Survey of Canada, the Canadian Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation, the CanMet network of laboratories from energy to materials to mining. So really we are a science-based department at our heart. My research background is in working with multi-agent systems. My PhD is in information science, and we study different ways in which my own research looked into how game theoretic principles could be used to reason about agents in multi-agent scenarios where they were simultaneously competing and cooperating at the same time. So artificial intelligence is a very interesting topic, and it's a topic du jour. Everybody talks about it, and today we'll actually get to talk to our panel members who really bring a lot of theoretical knowledge to the table, but equally importantly, they bring some very, very deep practical experiences to the table as well. But broadly speaking, we can think about AI, and I'm sure that folks in the audience, everybody has their own definition of AI. There is no generally accepted, universally accepted definition of AI. But if you think about it, having computational analogs of how biological organisms make decisions. There's a number of modules in that decision-making stack, if you think about it in that layered architecture. So there is perception, there is reckoning, there is judgment, there may be prediction, classification, clustering, those types of things. So we can think about AI in a very broad sense. And when we think about AI in terms of how we use it as everyday people, we have smartphones, we have smart watches. When we go to the hospital, they have enterprise systems which are driven by AI. When we travel on planes, when we go to airports, it almost seems like artificial intelligence and specifically machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning are permeating our world and essentially affecting us in every which way. And it's very clear that science is no exception. When you think about science, one of the things that excites me a lot, talking to scientists in Natural Resources Canada and in other departments, is really the ways in which AI is being used to complement and supplement their scientific activities and their scientific pursuits. So I know very often people think about, AI is going to come and replace jobs and take away this and take away that. Frankly speaking, what's very interesting is when you take a and both lens as opposed to an either or lens, you start to really see value propositions and opportunities to unpack a number of very interesting use cases where humans and these AI systems can truly coexist and can work together and really lead to win-win outcomes for everybody concerned. So having framed the conversation in that way, as I mentioned, whether or not we're talking about policy, whether we're talking science, AI is here to stay. It is going to impact the way that our colleagues in the government and outside government are going to make decisions and are going to use data to support their evidence-based decision making. I'm very happy to welcome the first of our panelists to the stage in just a moment, in the virtual stage. So the format we have is one where we're going to mix up the delivery so that everybody stays engaged, and that also we can immerse the audience into the participation process as well. So to begin with, I'm going to request each of our panelists to speak a little bit about their perspectives on artificial intelligence. We'll go through the entire panel, and then at that point, we'll actually get to the moderator assisted questions. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Ashley Casovan to this virtual stage, and I'd like to welcome you, Ashley, to share your thoughts and perspectives with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vic, and thanks for having me here. It's as Vic mentioned, he was part of a panel discussion last year, and I had the pleasure of being actually participating in that panel with him. So it's nice to be back and also be back specifically with Vic, but also really looking forward to this dialogue that we have today. For those of you that didn't catch my presentation last year, really it is kind of building off of that dialogue that we had, and as Vic mentioned at the top, just various different opportunities that we'll talk about today, where how AI can actually be used for science-based departments. And one of the things that I've been really interested in is what does that mean and how do we do this in a responsible way? So as he was mentioning, there's lots of different opportunities, and I think that we'll get into that through the course of the panel, but also mentioned that there's a need for kind of policy and thinking about the data implications as it relates to that. So I am currently on leave of absence from the Government of Canada. I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called AI Global, and I came to this organization because of the work that I did at Treasury Board Secretariat, where I was the director of data and digital, and they're really leading with the team the work around the directive on automated decision-making systems. And so now I know that's something that departments are having to consider when they're applying these applications within their organizations. And one of the things that I found when we were really thinking about how to even build this directive was what technologies are even being used. And so I'm definitely not going to go into a lot of detail in this, but have these slides for reference throughout our conversation today. And one of the things that I just really want to touch on as an introduction into this dialogue is when we talk about policy, we really need to be understanding how this technology is being used and what the potential implications of these different AI applications are. And so one of the things that we've done from an AI Global perspective is we've tried to understand the various different use cases. And again, these could be applications that are used in science-based departments, but also just kind of more broadly in the general population. And one of the things that we're finding when we were tracking various different use cases is that sometimes these applications, again, if used incorrectly, can have the opportunity to incorrectly identify people. It could also be used for incorrectly misdiagnosing or doing providing different predictions that are not accurate. Also, how they're being used, if we're thinking about things like facial recognition, is not understanding all different types of people equally, and whether that be by gender or by race. It's something that the technology is not currently there. And so these are types of things that we need to be keeping in mind. And so what we've been doing from an AI Global perspective is, as a nonprofit, we're really trying to not only create awareness that these are issues, but build actual policy guidance out around that. And again, that's really stemming from the work that we started with the directive, and then going into thinking about how do we actually put more measurable tools around the principles, and then also requirements that we put into that directive, because I think that's an important next step that we have when trying to get to a better objective to mitigate some of these harms that I've put on the slide here. Thanks, Vic. I'll leave it there for right now. I'm sure we're going to have a big dialogue around policy.
Thank you, Ashley. That's great. Always enjoy listening to your comments. And in fact, I think even after CSPS, we've had the pleasure of serving on multiple panel discussions together. So looking forward to continuing this streak of good exchanges of ideas. The next colleague I'd like to invite to the stage is Carolyn Waters, who's the Chief Digital Research Officer at National Research Council of Canada. And just as I've had the pleasure with Ashley to be on panel discussions, about 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of moderating a panel discussion on designing and developing successful AI strategies. And I was very impressed and very happy to hear many of the perspectives that Carolyn shared around governance, around explainability, around all of the important topics of AI, which sometimes can be missed in technology-only discussions, really bringing a policy lens to the table. And I'm pretty sure that today, when we talk to the panelists, we'll cover those topics a bit more detail. But without further ado, Carolyn, I'd like to pass the floor to you so you can share some of your perspectives with the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vic. It's a pleasure to be back. I enjoyed CSPC last year, so it's great to be back. I'll just introduce myself quickly. I come from Dalhousie University as a computer science professor, specializing in text analytics, human-computer interaction, and social media analytics. I was in administration there as well, so Dean of Grad Studies and then Provost. So recently I've been seconded on an interchange to the National Research Center as their Chief Digital Research Officer. So you may know that National Research Council has about 4,000 people involved in research across the country in 14 different research centers ranging from quantum sensors to chip fabrication, medical devices, new materials, and of course new technologies. So I'm the lead of one of those research centers called Digital Technologies Research Center, where we focus on AI, machine learning, research and development, and work closely with all the other research centers, other government departments, and of course, collaborations with universities. So I have kind of a mixed background here. One of the things, I was looking at benefits of AI in science departments. And I think one of the things we have to really consider is that it's really no longer viable to do science at scale without some kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning, different way of thinking about it. So that includes things like simulations. So running big simulations to look at different options carefully before we actually spend resources building option A, B, or C. It includes this whole digital twinning, like how do we get remote access and control of equipments at a distance? Canada's got one thing, Canada has lots of distance. So things up north, things in rural areas, things that need to be communicated. In satellites, our astronomy, telescopes, how do we get that data? And how do we actually function at a distance, and we need to do that by thinking differently about how we set up equipment at distance. The other really interesting thing around this is that the research problem, the problem sizes have become much more complex and much, much bigger. So we can no longer do it on the back of an envelope. We can no longer do it with regular computers in one place. We really need to think about how we scale these things up. And data, of course, has become a basic science resource, just like an old-fashioned lab specimen. And all of our government departments have lots of data. The real question is, how do we get value out of it? And I think also one of the benefits of introducing AI in science departments is that scientists, funders, citizens all have a new set of expectations around their environment. We expect that things are connected, we expect that things happen on a timely basis, and we expect that they've got some value add from computing in them. That brings, of course, a whole bunch of challenges, and my number one challenge, which I'm glad Ashley is here, she can speak more thoughtfully, is that currently ethics is an afterthought. So responsible AI means that we build it in from the beginning, that fairness in the benefit of AI and fairness in the economic implications are thought about while we're designing. Do we design in our design thinking? Do we bring stakeholders in? Do we think about it from a really robust and multi-dimensional perspective? And I think that that's something that we need to start to address before we build systems rather than sometime after. And we need to really look at hybrid structures. So what happens when we've got high performance computing, quantum computers, clouds, hybrids, Internet of Things, sensors everywhere? How do we actually think about that as a single system? And so I leave you with some benefits and some challenges, and I'm sure that we'll get into this in more depth as we go on. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn, for those perspectives. I'd like to now invite a colleague from Natural Resources Canada, Giles Bellefleur. Giles and I have worked together now at NRCan, and I'm very impressed with the forward thinking that Giles has exhibited in thinking beyond the horizon to bring interesting applications of artificial intelligence and data science to bear into the scientific exploration and experimentation process. So Giles, I'd like to turn to you to share your perspectives with us. Thank you.
Thank you also for the opportunity to present and be a member of this panel discussion. That's really appreciated. So I'm a research scientist at the Geological Survey of Canada. We'll bring a different perspective to the panel. My field of specialty is applied seismology. In a nutshell, that is the study of the subsurface using man-made seismic waves. So I basically generate methods and knowledge to improve the detection of buried mineral resources. And that includes any type of resources, also the critical minerals that we need to transition to our green economy. So I'm by no means an AI expert. I fall in the category of scientists that are adopting AI practices into their regular work. Now, if you want to do applied seismology, there are 3 disciplines that you need to master. The first one is physics, because seismic wave propagates into the subsurface, and physics describes those equations, the wave propagation equation very well. The second one is geology, because again, the waves propagate in the subsurface, and what we're trying to recover out of those seismic waves is geological information. And the third, which is maybe a little bit less intuitive, is rock mechanics, which is, for me, how much certain rock type deform when they are traversed by seismic waves. So rock mechanics provides the link between physics and geology. So I have data set coming from these 3 disciplines, and I have to do something with that. And some of those data sets are quite large. I would say the greatest challenge in my work is to combine everything to come to a cohesive result to properly help understand what is happening in the subsurface and how we can use that information to detect new deposits. So this is where AI comes into play. AI is, especially deep learning, is very good at combining different data sets together and finding trends and patterns that will improve the detection of these deposits. So I am collaborating with the Mile Institute in Montreal, which is one of Canada's largest institute on deep learning. There are others, but we're collaborating with them on such a project where we're trying to integrate all data from specific areas to understand the structure of it. Our ultimate goal really is to be able to use data not only from one mining site, but from many mining sites to find the key characteristics of specific deposit and use these characteristics to predict where we could find those deposits, not only at the local scale, but also at the regional scale. So this is something that cannot be done easily with traditional methods. This is very difficult to do. Challenges, there are of course challenges, like it was mentioned previously. Science-based departments have a lot of data, but sometimes that data is stuck somewhere in reports and in format that are not usable for AI. So I think we need some data strategy to be able to extract that data from the reports so we can leverage a little bit more our data to do more useful AI. And funny enough, AI may be a solution to this. I have a colleague at the GSC, Chris Lawley, who's collaborating with Element AI, and he's scanning through PDF reports to extract some information valuable for him, for his work. So far the results were promising. Still a little bit of work to do, but it's promising, and I think we should be doing more exercise like this to try to extract value out of the data we have stored in some reports. Thanks.
Thank you, Gilles, for that interesting introduction, and definitely looking forward to unpacking some of those in more detail. So as I now introduce our panelist, last panelist, Amir Ghasemi, I'd like to share a quick story which I like to tell folks in the data science business. So I remember the first time I met Amir in the Communication Research Center at ICED. He was kind enough to give me a tour of the deep learning models that they had built to predict different types of measures and different classifications. And Amir mentioned to me that he was using data from environment to predict sort of the load on cell phone towers, which would make sense because depending on how people think the weather is going to be, there may be saturation in the towers because there's a storm coming or there's a snow coming or something like that. And that's understandable. But then very interestingly, the innovator that Amir is, he sort of turned the problem on its head and said, can we start to now extrapolate insights about the environment or the weather based on cell phone tower usage? So, just really interesting. I like to think of Amir as an innovator to take the problem, turn it around, and really derive new insights from basically what are similar data sets. For the more technical folks, turning the labels into features and features into labels is one way you would think about it. But Amir, without further ado, I'd like to invite you to share some of your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Rick. Happy to be here with this great panel. So I'm a senior research scientist with Communication Research Center, as Vic mentioned. This is part of Innovation Science and Economic Development Canada. We are a federal government primary R&D lab for advanced telecommunications, such as 5G technologies. Basically, where we fall is somewhere in between academia and private sector in terms of our research and research horizon specifically. So just to give you a basically quick overview of our modernization journey, I think this is helpful as part of the discussion today. So 5 years ago, CRC, we had an aging on-premise data center. Basically, if you would walk into any office or any room, you would see multiple computers and servers on their people's desks. So every cubicle essentially was basically a lab. And our research community was really attached to their traditional models and tools that they've been using for so long. But CRC today, after the transition we had over the past few years, we now have a fully cloud-powered data science program. Basically, people have access, on-demand access to high-performance compute in the cloud, public cloud, and our research is really scalable because of that. We have fully embraced open source software. As we know, one of the great things about AI and machine learning today is how open the community is. It's really built upon sharing of advances as quickly as possible. And our scientists today are really exhibiting an increased adoption of AI and ML into their typical workflow. So now we have integrated a whole bunch of new technologies into the way we do our science. So this journey has brought some new opportunities for us. We've been able to automate some of the routine labor-intensive processes that our department has to do. Some examples include granting of licenses for operation to different operators. That's a very labor-intensive for our department. We've been able to automate some of that process. Also looking into compliance. So we have a big network of sensors deployed across Canada that is reporting real-time data to our cloud. We have machinery that processes that data and then can look into compliance automatically. We've been able to improve some of our decision-making by leveraging these large amounts of data that comes from the field. So basically, you can close the loop on some of your current policies. You have the ability now to look at the outcome of the policies that you've put into place and basically make better policies going forward. And as two examples in terms of collaboration with other government departments, OGDs, Vic mentioned the work with Environment and Climate Change Canada, leveraging crowdsourced data sets for them, opening up this new world of extended data sets for their scientists. And more recently, we've been supporting Public Health Agency of Canada on their COVID-19 response by giving them some insights on the mobility of Canadians and how that has contributed to the spike in cases. Of course, we had a bunch of challenges getting to where we are today. So the obvious one was infrastructure and resources. We could not have come as far as we have if we wanted to rely on our 20-year-old infrastructure. So the migration to the cloud and being cloud native really opened up the door for us. And also building up a diverse pool of talent. So we come from a STEM background, most of us in the science community. So we've been able to train and retrain a good number of our scientists and researchers into these new technologies related to AI and ML, and they've been picking those up and running with it, essentially. Data literacy, I'm sure it will come up today during our panel. So both inside and outside scientific teams. Obviously, you would expect the scientists to be well-versed in working with the data, but it's also needed across the agencies and government departments, from the policy making to data collection to execution to reporting. You need a certain degree of data literacy, because that's needed to set the expectations, obviously, and being able to ask the right questions for the researchers to work on towards. And I would say that if you want successful AI strategy for any, whether it's private sector or government department, you need a culture shift and building up of trust. So initially, we had within our own research staff a skepticism towards AI. And these black box models are not going to replace our tried and tested, battle-tested physical models, scientific models. But by basically making a distinction between AI-based systems versus AI-augmented systems, we've been able to bridge that gap. So initially, having a human expert in the loop who just received some recommendations from the AI system and acting upon those information, we've been able to build up that trust within our research community. So just a quick summary of what I said so far. So data-driven analytics have been a great help for us. It has changed our entire science program, basically, at CRC. The key here for us has been the ability, as Vic mentioned, the ability to ingest and fuse very large, diverse, heterogeneous, and often noisy data sets. If we want to handle increasingly complex systems, and for us, it's telecommunication networks that are becoming very, very sophisticated, you need to be able to make these links across a wide variety of data sets and drawing up correlations that are not obvious even to the human experts. You need to be able to extract those automatically by leveraging AI. And finally, so starting with the right questions, I think that's the key. Making the data and resources obviously available. So cloud was the key for us in that realm, and the culture shift. So I stop here. I'm sure we'll get into more detail on some of these items.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amir. That's very kind of you to share your perspectives. And as I reflect back on the comments that Ashley and Carolyn and Giles and Amir shared, you know, it's fascinating that we covered not just different levels from strategic to tactical to operational, but we also covered different sides of the coin, if you will. We talked about some of the technology topics. We also talked about the very, very important topic around governance and the functional aspects of what AI systems do when you actually put them into production. So very interesting, and we're definitely going to dive into this. And one thing I remember from last year's CSPC is how involved and how active the audience was in every session that I was at. And so since we don't have people in the same room, which is unfortunate, but at least now technology allows us to have a pretty good degree of participation and engagement, I would say, with the folks that are taking the time to join this panel discussion. So I'd like to now open up to a poll. In fact, there's going to be a series of 3 questions that will be asked. You'll have a minute and a half to answer those poll questions. And when the poll concludes, then we'll take some insights from there and jump straight into our panel discussion. So the poll is open now. Okay, I see that we have some polling data here. We have the majority of colleagues from the government. We have some folks from also academia, nonprofit, private, and business. That's great. So I think this is the first poll. So we'll just get started with the rest of the presentation. I think that the other questions will follow later, if I understand correctly. Okay. So with this in mind, bearing in mind that we have a number of colleagues from government, I think the next question is aligned quite well. And I'd like to follow the original order of the prepared remarks just to ensure that we keep everybody engaged in the conversation. So we talked a lot about science-based departments and agencies. I see there's a few other questions coming. Perhaps I'll pause for a second. and see if all 3 poll questions come at the same time. Okay, so now we see that there are results around the composition of attendees in terms of their primary function in the organization. So we have a lot of colleagues who are from management side, colleagues from the policy analyst position, scientists and researchers. So that's a very good mix to talk about science policy integration, support staff, as well as students and interns. That's great. So we're getting a picture of who's attending to calibrate the questions. And I think there's one more question. There we go. Perfect. This has to do with people's familiarity with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Okay, so I see that most of the colleagues mentioned that they're aware of some of the opportunities regarding AI and machine learning research. I think that's great because, I mean, although there's a range of skills that folks have in the audience, but we're going to try to keep the conversation to a level that is accessible and is approachable to everybody. And in fact, that was the intent of this panel discussion to begin with. So I think based on the responses to the polls, I'd like to now invite the panelists to come on and talk a little bit about some of the questions that I'll be posing. So the first question I want to ask has to do with SBDA, science-based departments and agencies, and that's really what the title of this talk is about as well. And when we think about artificial intelligence, I mean, there's been a Cambrian explosion. There's been just so many new advances and breakthroughs, and everywhere you look, there's some new language model, there's some new computer vision model, there's some new reinforcement learning agent that can train the world champion in this game or that game. So with this kind of tsunami of news about these technical breakthroughs, but even breakthroughs on the other side when it comes to things like explainability, privacy, governance, etc., how can government colleagues focusing in science, policy, technology, R&D, all different areas, how can they stay abreast of all of the latest and greatest developments coming out? Because certainly to be able to leverage them and to apply them and to be able to benefit from their value propositions, one needs to be aware of what's really happening. So Ashley, I'd like to turn to you. How would you think that colleagues should best stay abreast of the latest and greatest advances that they can meaningfully apply to advance their work?
You're on mute, Ashley. Sorry.
Hello? Is that good now?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a big question and it's definitely a big challenge as well. And so one of the things that even when we were trying to build the directive on automated decision-making systems, there was a discussion around what is the definition of AI and what should we, like really what are we solving for? And one of the things that we wanted to do and is not call it a directive on related to responsible AI for that specific reason is because we really thought about it more in terms of a broader use of technology. And as you're saying, those things are changing so drastically. And when we think of this broad scope of technology changes, combined with data changes, combined with policy changes, all integrated into one, it's really difficult for any one individual, yet a team to kind of stay on top of all of these things. And I think that's why policy instruments that are enabling to some degree are definitely important. And it's really important that units like the one that I was in at Treasury Board are supported so that they can be a central agency that's working to support not only science-based departments, but all departments, so that that type of information, you kind of have a one-stop shop to go to, that they're staying on top of not only the various different techniques for solving bias and fairness, but then even who the service providers are that can help kind of navigate those pieces and also keep the policy itself up to date. In absence of that, and if any individual departments kind of tracking those things, I think that internal community of practices are really, really important, whether it be at the departmental level or whether it be at kind of your unit level, just sharing that knowledge. And one of the things that I really liked that Amir spoke about was the open nature of AI. And I think that's one of the things, and for those of you that don't know my background, which is probably everyone, I really come from a background of open data and open government. I started at the federal government building the open government portal. And so that's near and dear to how I approach all of this work. And so that idea of being able to collaborate on various different models remains important to me. And so the work that we're doing with AI Global, as in the the map that I showed in that slide, is a way that we're not only tracking our own use cases, but we realize that in doing so, it would be a valuable tool to share with the community. So on our portal, on our website at aiglobal.org, you can actually see that map. And in the spirit of open data and open government, you're able to suggest a use case as well. So we recognize also, as being one of the representatives in this space, that we can't necessarily keep on top of absolutely everything. And so providing that option where there's that crowdsourcing, whether again it be for models or for just tracking case studies, is important. And then the last thing that I would add that we're doing is, again, in the spirit of open government and really what my roots are, providing a community portal for those various different resources. And so it's down right now because it's in development. We'll re-release it in January, but we've been tracking. We have thousands of both resources, so various different policies, various different data sets. So there could be data sets for ground truth testing, which will become important in, I think, some of the stuff that Giles and Amir will talk about. And then also various different types of techniques that can be used. And so these are the types of things and types of activities that I think need to continue to be added to.
Thank you, Ashley. Very interesting, and we very much look forward to relaunch of that website so we can all benefit from the content there. Carolyn, I'd like to turn to you. Building on something you had mentioned in your prepared remarks, broad general question, but maybe I can focus it a little bit. Even when we talk about ethics, and as Ashley touched on fairness and bias, even there's a lot of breakthroughs coming out in debiasing techniques, algorithmic fairness techniques. Irrespective of whether we take a narrow lens or a broad lens, how would you advise colleagues to really stay up to date and on top of the latest and greatest information coming out about applied AI?
Well, that's a great question to which I don't have a great answer, Rick, but I'll give it a try. I think there's two parts to that, and I'll start with the sort of end goal. I think the end goal here is, in Canada and in provinces, to really build policy frameworks, to really think about building these AI questions in consultation with all of our social science researchers and agencies, to build in regulations that reflect the multi-shareholder perspective. Do these things, how do we make sure that there's benefit to Canada and to Canadians, and actually think about agile governance models that we are going to need to manage this very complex situation. You can't just have three politicians deciding A, B, and C. We actually have to think about it much more holistically. And I think that a holistic thinking has to be in a future orientation rather than building on cases that are based on print or typewriters or whatever, like actually thinking forward and how we do that. And one way that I think we can actually show leadership as science-based departments is to actually build and use platforms. So open collaboration and open collaborations with colleges and universities, open collaborations with all of our other OGDs, Let's do joint projects. Then everybody learns, everybody's a different place in the technology and their perspective on it. Let's bring in more students and postdocs. Let's do things with universities who are, that's their bread and butter, just out there pushing some imaginary string. Let's bring them into the conversation. Let's do more secondments and exchanges of researchers. So have Giles go to a university for a while, and a university person come to Giles for a while. You know, the kinds of things that we do in a small scale, but maybe we should think about it in a bigger scale. And coming out of that, I would say that one thing that we really need to do is to build communities of practice across the science-based departments. We need to really think more as a collection. If you think of all the government departments, there's only 10 or 11 science-based ones. We have a lot more in common with each other than we do with the other departments. So we should form communities of practice and ensure that we are keeping up with it and to really move forward. I think that they're the two places where I would really focus.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Very interesting perspective. Giles, I'd like to turn to you now. Same general question, but perhaps I can frame it a little bit in terms of, you mentioned that rock mechanics is sort of where geology comes together with physics, and that's already an established field from what you mentioned. And now you're already taking that to the next level by bringing in sort of deep learning thinking and machine learning thinking to it. So where is it that you're looking at to get insights and to be inspired to keep up with or to embrace some of these breakthroughs which are coming out? Are you looking primarily at the scientific literature, or as Ashley mentioned, are you also looking at some of the more open source types of sources? Where is it that you're finding this kind of technical and non-technical knowledge to deploy in your scientific endeavors?
Yeah, well, for me, you know, I have to stay current in my field of expertise, so it's difficult. It's almost impossible to keep track of all the stuff that's happening within AI. And pretty much the only way I have to do this is by collaboration, either internally within the government or externally with research institute, universities. And that's an approach that that we've took with the Milan Institute. Now, making those collaboration with such institute is not necessarily straightforward. You cannot just dump your data on their desk and say, please do something with our data with AI. That simply doesn't work. Both sides have to develop an understanding of the data, of the methods, to make the best sound decision about which algorithm to pick, which approach to choose to make sure we reach the objective of the project. This is more challenging than it looks like when you use non-traditional data, special data, such as seismic data, rock mechanics data. These are not standard data used for AI. So there are three things that you need to do to get a good collaboration with the research institutes. First is you need to discuss, you need to have a good communication strategy to explain what are the techniques that you're using, what is the data, what is the meaning of the data, how is it acquired, what's the processing applied to it. That's the first thing. Second thing, everybody on the team has to be willing to learn a new discipline. There's some learning involved. Without it, I don't think you can really move those projects forward. And the last thing is you need patience, a lot of patience. As an example, the discussion we talked with Milan Institute for about 1.5 years before the project started. So it's a long process to get up to speed on everybody, you know, put everybody at the same level to be able to bring the project forward. I'm not saying all projects will need that kind of involvement, but you know, reaching a level of understanding and being able to talk technically from both sides is very important. So this is where I look for external collaboration, really.
Thank you, Giles. Very interesting, and I'm sure we'll touch on different aspects of that as well as we go into next questions. Amir, same question to you. You talked about sort of this way of thinking about AI where you're working with noisy data sets. You have problems that may not be very, very well defined. Also, the technologies that you're using are adapting and evolving very, very quickly. So what's your source of kind of guidance and knowledge in terms of thinking about data science techniques to bring to your scientific projects?
Yes, so that's a great question. First of all, I echo other panelists' comments. So we have that top-down approach of basically having frameworks, policy, community of practice. And by the way, StatCan recently started that community of practice for data science within the government, which I think is a great initiative. Hopefully more colleagues would join from other departments. But perhaps I could bring in a complementary view here. It's the organic, grassroots type of thing, starting from the bottom at the working level for researchers. It's by having that culture of being inquisitive and giving the researchers some flexibility, some freedom, some of their time to explore. Right? These concepts are new to us. Maybe they're not so new in the machine learning community, but application of these concepts in applied sciences are somewhat new. So one of the great initiatives that I could bring from my own experiences at CRC, we have about 10% of our research scientists' time allocated for this kind of tinkering, exploring new subjects, new technologies, and bringing those, seeing how they could be adapted to the problems we are solving with our own data sets. To make that a success, obviously you need some foresight, you need some reporting mechanisms, sharing of results on an ongoing basis, and some clearly defined targets. So if everybody's on board with the kind of mission we have and what problems we are trying to solve, then I think that does help, right? So you give the scientists some time to explore and the resources to be able to achieve that, for which you would need some access to cloud computing and all these types of GPU machines and machines with many cores, cluster computing that can run these advanced models that people are putting out there. And then you'll see after a while the results will start to come in.
Thank you, Amir. Very interesting. And as I look back at the answers that all of the panelists provided, I mean, they're truly synergistic and truly complementary. Ashley talked about the importance of open data and open science. Carolyn talked about the notion of communities of practice for knowledge sharing, for collaborative learning. Giles talked about the importance of collaborations and partnerships with subject matter experts, because sort of knowledge doesn't reside in isolation. And then Amir talked about the importance of culture. So keeping all of these things together, I want to definitely open up the floor now if panelists have maybe thoughts that they want to share above and beyond before I move to the next question. Really synergistic perspectives from my point of view. But if anybody has additional comments to share, the floor is open.
Maybe I just want to add to what Amir said. Sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just very quickly, Amir spoke about culture, but also about leadership. And I think that that's really important, that foresight to have, and Carolyn, you spoke about this as well, sorry, just about thinking about both in terms of policy, but then implementation, I think is super, super important and a very understated piece of all of this. We can be on these panels and talk about this, and until somebody that's in a leadership position says, yes, you can allocate 10% of your time, or we need to anticipate policy that's not what's needed now, but in 5 years from now, and you need to be researching it, these things don't happen because, as Jill said, this stuff takes time. And I just wanted to really emphasize that piece.
Thank you, Ashley. Yes, great point. Carolyn, your thoughts?
So I'm going to just coattail on Ashley here. The culture, I think, is the number one thing that we have to watch. We really have to embrace, and we have to think about what's the value for people who are already in the system to go and learn new things, think about different paradigms, use up their 10 or 20% of what I call skunks works, like you go and do things that aren't directly related to a project. And that only works, oh my goodness, I'm falling apart. I'll have to come back. Sorry, Rick.
No problem, Carolyn. Hope you feel better. And there we go. That should help.
Maybe I can pick up on that.
Yes. I have lost my voice. That it's the leadership who sets the tone for actually making changes and accepting that some things have a long runway, some things have a short runway, and sometimes we have to stop doing something we've done for 50 years to do something we're going to do for the next 50 years. Apologies for the interruptions.
Not a problem, Carolyn. Totally understood. Amir, over to you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, I totally agree. AI is a highly experimental field still. So that needs to be acknowledged. It's not a silver bullet, so you can just buy it off the shelf and deploy it and start to get results out of it. It does not work that way. And each of the science-based departments has its own set of data sets and problems to work with, right? So off-the-shelf solutions typically do not work. You need basically some freedom, some flexibility to bring the tools, but marry those with the data sets that you have and the type of problems you have. So as long as the management, the leadership recognizes that experimentation and the need to have some failures, right? So fail often, fail fast, right? That mentality needs to be ingrained if we are going to basically deploy AI widely and be in it for the long run, essentially.
Thank you. Thank you, Amir. Gilles, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I'm all on board with the collaboration with different departments. I think that's going to help a lot. I think we will learn a lot from each other, from, like Amir said, the mistake, but also the good shots that we made. And that's key to the success of implementing AI within the departments, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you to all the panelists. So I'd like to now move us to the next question. And the next question has to do with a priority that was identified and well articulated in the speech from the throne. Before we do that, I think there is another poll that we'll do now. So I'll pause on the second question. Why don't we have a poll right now? Okay, I think we will see some results coming through. So we see that better collaborations across departments and agencies seems to be a major challenge that folks think is leading to obstacles in the adoption of AI. Okay, so I think we can go to the next question now. If I remember correctly, I don't think there's a second question in this poll. So I'd like to get to the next question, which has to do with a priority that was identified and articulated in the speech from the throne, and this has to do with diversity and inclusion. And the question is that how might socio-technical breakthroughs lead to positive diversity and inclusivity practices and outcomes to ensure that the applications of AI and data science more generally and big data are beneficial to all? So Ashley, I'd like to start with you again.
Thanks. I think that one of the biggest things that we really need to be focusing on with technology is that it is a reflection, or how we implement it is a reflection of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And in a lot of these circumstances, when we're talking about the need for diversity and inclusion, that is also needs to be reflected back to the culture conversation we were just having, being thought about in terms of how are we applying these technology solutions. And that's why I said at the top that independent of whether or not it's an AI system that has learning components, or you're talking about AI in terms of data analytics, or you're just thinking about any type of technology. And I like how Amir had separated artificial from augmentation. It's really important that we're thinking about what those potential consequences or unintended consequences are when adopting these systems. And that's why I think so much time is being spent on having discussions about what are the ethics and what do we need to be thinking about when adopting these systems, especially at least in the world that I operate in. I hope everybody's having these conversations. But one of the challenges that I'm seeing is people ask me lots, like, what are you most afraid of? And yes, it's incredibly concerning to see companies like Clearview not really care about rules, and when it's related to grabbing data off of publicly available websites and not following kind of common consent practices. That said, while that is a problem. I think that most companies do want to do a good job, or most people that are developing these systems do want to do a good job, but don't necessarily know how to do it. And that continues to perpetuate existing social biases that we already have, existing kind of problems that we're not addressing in our systems already. And my challenge with these technologies is that it's just expediting it. And as Carolyn mentioned in her presentation at the beginning, these technologies are inevitable. It's not a question, and it's becoming the expectation. It's not a question of when or if they're going to be implemented. It's a question of when and how quickly. And so if we're not thinking then about how we're designing how we do these processes, because that's really what it is, a transition from manual processes to automated processes, then we're just, in my view, expediting and doubling down, tripling, quadrupling down on these existing societal problems that we've already created for ourselves. And I think that that's the biggest challenge that I see.
Thank you, Ashley. Very interesting. Thank you for that perspective. Carolyn, same question to you is, how do we ensure that the socio-technical capabilities and the promises of artificial intelligence and big data more broadly are really brought to bear to benefit all, as opposed to just a select few?
Well, I think the only way we're going to get that is through policy and regulation. But let me talk at more depth about what I think we are. There are a couple of things I think that the reason we need to do this to make it beneficial. The first is we need to level the playing field. So we need to ensure that all Canadians, essentially, whatever the demographic is or whatever the location, have access to the new technologies. So that the second thing is we really need to understand and prevent the reaping of the benefits from AI to a very small number of kind of monopolies. So how do we actually make sure that there's a fairness in distribution and of the benefits of this new change? Because it will change society. It changes who has access to services. It changes who has access to healthcare in many ways, because you have to have that data, who has access to remote healthcare. We have to make sure that there's a transparency of the results, that we can explain to every single user how it is that decision was made. You can't just say, oh, a neural net did it. This is not a sufficient explanation. And I think that it clearly means that you can't do any of this unless the data itself is fully representative and it's at some level at least standardized enough to be used in multiple areas with concerns around privacy, standardization, are you comparing oranges and apples? And again, I think this is somewhere where the government really has a role in producing a new generation of policies. The second part of this, I think, is the way that we actually develop and we use it. Development teams, I believe, need to be much more representative of the kinds of people who are going to use it and the kind of areas. Development does mean that you're encoding policy. So if we don't have a policy, you're still encoding policy. You're still making decisions about how this machine works. And I think that the new emphasis on design thinking, which means that at the very beginning of a design cycle, you start to engage all the stakeholders. It's not just a matter of what the algorithm looks like or what the system looks like. So it's not really an IT architecture problem. It's a solution problem space. And we need all of the stakeholders in that. And they need to be in there at all the stages of testing and research and design, so that we can actually leverage the value of different perspectives and leverage the different ways we have of understanding solutions and understanding problems, which I think we don't do. We have great opportunities in Canada, and we have not so far done a really leading role in that. So those are the two areas that I would work on. Thanks, Beck.
Thank you, Carolyn. Gilles, I'd like to ask you the same question, is in terms of these technological breakthroughs and even functionality breakthroughs, how can we ensure that better diversity and inclusivity practices are realized and manifested as a result of them? Gilles, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I was just saying it's a difficult question. It's a broad question, but the key is really to engage with all stakeholders, like Carolyn was saying. And maybe I can bring a different perspective from experience I have in my work, which means which involves communication, engagement with First Nation. We do this before we have a survey. We talk to them for consultation. Or they are involved in the project somehow, or they participate as contractors. So with some group of First Nation, they're really well organized, and they will certainly adopt any AI technology that we can provide as long as they see benefit in it for them, and they may even be willing to participate in the development of those technologies. But there are some cases where some groups are very difficult to engage with. It's almost impossible to talk to them. They have different priorities, they have different agenda. So in this case, I think we'll need more than just simple socio-technical development to be able to reach them. I understand this is a broader and a totally different questions, but the key point here is socio-technical tools are part of our toolbox. And it's just one of the tools that we have to engage with to increase diversity and inclusivity within the government, I think.
Thank you, Gilles. And Amir, the same question to you around using these types of social technical breakthroughs to advance better application of outcomes related to diversity and inclusion.
Right. Great points made so far. So I agree with everything that has been said. I would say that AI by nature and technology by nature, it's bias agnostic completely, right? It's just how you feed it, how you train it, and the target you set for it during the training process to come up with these models. So I would echo what has been said so far in terms of asking the right policy questions. What is it that we are trying to optimize? If you are trying to minimize your cost for deploying a solution, a product for public, you're almost guaranteed that the algorithm would go with a racially biased solution, right? There's this famous example from US just published last year. So there's this healthcare system that serves millions of people, and for access to a higher grade of medical care, they were using a solution provided by a third-party provider. That third-party provider has an algorithm that predicts which patient should be picked for admission into that program on the basis of minimizing cost. And they found out that it was racially biased against African Americans because they were perceived to put a higher cost on the system. So you see the issue right there. The question that was asked of them was to minimize cost, provide the maximum value. If you do not put equity and diversity, inclusiveness as part of what you're trying to optimize, part of what you're trying to train for, the algorithm is going to give you what you asked of it, right? So I echo what Carolyn said. It's important to have very diversified teams designing these things, because there's a higher likelihood of people identifying these things during the design stages if it's a diversified team. And then having a top-down approach, bringing in the policy and making sure when we ask the question, when we engage the stakeholders, it's fully representative.
Thank you, Amir. So very interesting comments from all the panelists here. I heard about policy and regulation. I heard about still the importance of good leadership, strong leadership culture. We heard about sort of, as Amir mentioned, this notion of if the algorithms are themselves sort of bias agnostic, but then what function are we training? What are we trying to optimize for? So I'd like to open up, having heard what all the other panelists said, I'd like to open up the floor now to anybody who has additional comments to add at this time. No? Okay.
I think we can spend an entire panel on this.
Yes.
But I think that's exactly what, when I said at the beginning that these were the problems that I was trying to solve for, that we didn't get the opportunity to within the directive, is it's putting measurement around those things. And so that's why I approach this in a super high level way to say we can have these objectives of mitigating harm or mitigating discrimination, but you have to really still look at how you're going to approach that, like Amir is saying, and the types of techniques in which what we've designed and what we're doing at AI Global is really what Carolyn's talking about is we have an open source tool, so I encourage anybody to go and use it, called a Responsible AI Design Assistant, and it's using that concept of design thinking to be able to actually not only get the right people around the table, but then also to be thinking about what types of questions you should be asking yourself.
Thank you, Ashley. Carolyn, I think you also had some comments.
Yeah, I did, and I think that one thing we have to, the core problem here is the data, right? So you have to have appropriate data that's very representative. The other thing we worry about is algorithms change and get amended, and software fixes, etc. So you may have done due diligence and unintended consequences at the beginning, but what is the certification process for actually making sure that modifications to the systems don't in fact bring in some really nasty unintended consequences as you go forward?
Thank you, Carolyn. Gilles, Amir, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just add that I totally agree. I would just add that everything needs to be done up front in terms of doing due diligence. But just with any technology, there's going to be some unintended consequences, right? You cannot entirely remove that. So it's also paramount to have some fail-safe mechanism. The issue here is that the pervasiveness of AI in our society today. So with it, if there are bad consequences, it's going to have a great impact. So just having a real-time feedback loop for these mechanisms to identify problems early on and adapt as needed, I think is a big requirement.
Yeah, I think the key there is to have the technical part and the social part being developed in harmony together. That's really what the message I got here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you, Amir. And I'm really excited to hear, Ashley, about that design assistant. I think that will be a very big helpful tool, because certainly to be able to envision the many futures possible, as Carolyn said, that you definitely don't want to only be kind of tunnel visioned or narrow vision to optimize one thing and then kind of forget about any side effects. But also, as Amir said, it's not possible to anticipate every possible outcome. So, but having a design assistant like that, even if it can narrow the scope of what's possible to be missed, I think can help people to focus on really some of the bigger challenges that they can identify. So really looking forward to that portal, as you mentioned earlier, but also this design assistant tool. So thank you for that. Okay, so thank you to the panelists. I think this has been a very interesting discussion. We still have time, and I'd like to open up for audience questions. So as I understand it correctly, I'll be able to see questions from the audience on my screen, and then we'll select some questions, and given the time, we'll try to ask as many of them as we can. So the floor is open for audience to ask any questions in the chat, and we'd be happy to ask them to our panelists. Okay. I'm just going to moderate questions here. Okay, so I can see a number of questions. Wow, very interesting. Okay, so let me see here. Let me pick one question here. There's so many to pick from, folks. I think we might need another, as Ashley said, we might need a full-on conversation here just on these questions. Let me pick a good one here. Okay, so I think why don't we try this one here? Let me try this one. So we know that, for example, the government of Canada is embarking on a science infrastructure initiative. Are there any infrastructure considerations that will facilitate or hinder adoption of AI and SBDAs? So Amir, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you, because I remember in your prepared remarks, you had a slide that touched on infrastructure. And even though the concept of infrastructure here might be slightly different than the way you described it, would you like to take a first shot at this question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there's two aspects to infrastructure when it comes to AI solutions. There's your typical IT type infrastructure, which here, for a lot of departments, it would mean some level of migration to the cloud, right? For high performance computing, which is typically needed for a lot of these massive data sets, it's simply not feasible to go through our regular procurement cycle. And at the end of the day, you might need those very high powered servers or machines for very short periods of time. The nature of our research needs is typically bursty. You are researching something, you need to run some quick simulation, but for a long time after that, you might be just visualizing the results, doing some other work. So I would say that cloud does help with that. Not only it's greener to work that way, it's also highly efficient to have access to the latest and greatest. The second aspect that is needed in addition to the typical IT infrastructure is the data infrastructure. How do you wrangle all these different heterogeneous data sets that for many departments, they might be in data silos, or even sometimes we call them data jails because they are so hard to get access to them. How do we bring all of those together and make sure that they are curated, labeled properly? Typically, as Gilles mentioned, some of these data sets are highly specific in nature. They're highly technical. They are collected with advanced sensors. So you need technical expertise from each of these sections or departments that would go over data quality, make sure that it's all good, label it properly for the downstream tasks or other researchers or other OGD departments that are going to use it. So designing a unified data infrastructure or data lake, data warehouse around these data sets is also a very key issue, I think.
Thank you, Amir. Ashley or Carolyn or Giles, would you like to add to that on the infrastructure question?
Yeah, I would say the data. Go ahead, Ashley.
No, go ahead.
I would just say like the data infrastructure to me is the most important part, because the cloud access is fairly straightforward. Once you have an account and you know how to operate it, I don't think it's a big issue. So the big work to be able to use the data for AI is to build the infrastructure for the data, and that's key. It has to be planned ahead as much as possible.
Ashley?
I was just going to say +1 on the data, but also making sure that you have all of the appropriate skill sets for that. And again, this goes back to kind of our leadership and planning piece of it. And so as much as I think we need to think about infrastructure and be concerned about those types of costs, we need to think about kind of policy and planning as a capital cost that goes into that, which we would typically associate with infrastructure.
Thank you. And Carolyn?
So can I? Yeah. So I think that one of I agree with, like, data is at the core of all of this, and as we move forward, we do need to think about these hybrid situations, complex solution spaces we get into, and some of them, because it is the government of Canada, some of them will have security issues. And so we have to think of a much more nuanced way of providing security where it's needed and letting the scientists in particular loose where they don't need it. The problem is that individual scientists have varying amounts of need for security at various times. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all. How do you actually have kind of a virtual desktop for security, in a sense? So you're doing part of your work in a secure area and part that isn't, and you're able to think about the solution more than the difficulties around security, which tends to build silos, which isn't helpful for collaboration. It isn't helpful for sharing data. There's lots of good reasons to have security, but there's lots of good reason to have areas where it's more open source. We've got standards. We're building platforms that we can use for different areas. And it's something that I think we haven't really come to grips with.
Thank you, Carolyn. So great answers by the panelists. Maybe I can ask a couple more questions in the interest of time. We do have some time. I see that now there's a lot of upvoting going on in certain questions. So perhaps I'll ask the question that has the most upvotes here. Ashley, I'll start with you here. The question is Canada's Privacy Act sufficient to protect privacy in the age of AI?
The new one or the old one?
Yes,
Are we
good
talking
question.
about the 11? Well, for those of you that don't know, there was the first reading of Bill C-11 yesterday, which is going to assume several policies, but including the outdated Privacy Act. So yes, it currently is. I will use this opportunity to actually say that something that Carolyn said earlier really reminded me of this. And I do think that it's incredible that the Privacy Commissioner's Office, along both at the federal level and at various different provincial levels as well, I think have taken really significant strides to not only doing consultations, but also trying to think about these privacy concerns as it relates to data, but then also the systems that data is using and interacting with. The one thing that I would say, though, back to a point Carolyn made earlier around policy planning, is that I think that even though that's tackling some privacy concerns, it still is not addressing now concerns that we need to be anticipating, whether it comes to, and maybe this is not the job of the privacy commissioner, but just because it is, the shorthand of it is implementing the digital policy or digital principles. I do think that we really need to be addressing also some of those things that we talked about earlier in terms of bias and discrimination and how that data is interacting with these systems, and even potentially also thinking about the implications that it has on whether or not there's individual choice in whether or not we get access to certain systems, because there's different barriers now to companies accessing that data. And so I think that there's going to be a bit of a tension in the implementation of this new bill if it does get passed, which I really hope it does, because it does a lot of really, really good things. I think it just really, we need to be anticipating and adapting at a much quicker cycle, because the last one didn't even mention the internet. So
very, very interesting, Ashley. And if I may add, I remember when you and I were on the same panel at the data conference with the government of Canada in February, I believe, you had made a very interesting point about being able to now look at other countries that have privacy regimes that do, in fact, to different extents cover AI data science. So can we be inspired by sort of tracking the deltas? I remember that comment you made, which was very interesting as well. Great. Carolyn, can I turn to you now? Same question. I mean, doesn't have to be specifically about the Privacy Act. I remember you talked about the notion of privacy and regulation and sort of enforcement. So where would you kind of more broadly answer the question, even if it's not about the specific Privacy Act?
Well, yeah, I don't know the specific Privacy Act that's in Parliament, but I'm sure it's a step forward. I'll take Ashley on that. But I do think that as we build these policies, we need to disengage a bit from our legacy systems and engage more, so that we're down a path where we can not anticipate exactly what's coming our way, but we have an idea of what quantum will do, you know, what the internet's going to look like in 20 years is not going to look like it does now. Who has access, hackability. And so how is our Privacy Act actually defending the rights and the benefits of citizens, and differentiating between the ability of companies or governments to do things versus the intended and or unintended consequences of citizens in a quickly evolving digital world that none of us actually quite understand, right? So I do worry that we pass something and then we wait for 10 years of it not, things passing it by, so it's not quite working, and then we have to start again. It takes another 10 years. So is there some way we can have a more agile policy on this? No idea how to do it. I'll just put that in.
Thank you, Carolyn. Gilles, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'll follow up with a question with Amir as well, though. Same theme, but doesn't have to be exactly about the same Privacy Act per se. Gilles, you talked about collaboration, and this is something that I know when we do a number of AI projects, we collaborate with research institutes and universities and private corporations and OGDs. So, when it comes down to collaboration, the data that you have been gathered and generated from different sources for different usage, kind of declared uses, if you think about it that way. How do you manage that part of the relationship with your collaboration partners? How do you make sure that it's great that you have access to their expertise and their compute and their specialisms and their knowledge, but how do you at the same time make sure that the data to which you are the custodian, that when it leaves your boundary, or if it doesn't leave your boundary, that it's going to be managed in a way that is privacy preserving and privacy protecting?
Yeah, that's a very... Oh, I'm okay. So yeah, that's a very good question. The main thing is we try to do in collaboration is to use open data. That simplifies the whole process of collaboration with external partners. But sometimes we do have confidential data. They're coming from companies. It's a bit more challenging in this case. We have to sort, each data set has to be sorted out one by one. We have to ask permission from the company to open it somehow, to make it available to the third party, the external party. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. So I think it's a case by case for each data set. it complicates a little bit what you can do, because people in deep learning, they like to have access to a huge amount of data. So the more we have, the better. But it's a bit tricky sometimes with confidential data. Yeah.
Amir, same question for you.
Okay, so the government is the owner of vast data, right? But when you come to the actual execution at the working level, you don't see much of it. So one of our biggest challenges in working with external collaborators or even other OGDs is access to the data, because there's usually not clear guidance on what is shareable and what is not, either within government or with outside parties. So I think it's one of those things that you need to ingrain more data literacy across organizations, so that they understand the issues with sharing different parts of the data, what is confidential, what is not, and what is good for within the government sharing, and what is the end goal of the product. Let's say you train a model, an AI model on some data that has some confidential information. You're not sharing the data with any outside parties, but if you're going and deploying that model that is trained on that kind of data, still includes parts of that data. Somebody smart enough could extract parts of the confidential information from these models' output. So it's really tricky. It's not as simple as it used to be, where you just put the data in the jail and you're good to go. If you still release the model, you're letting go of some of the information. So I just want to say that that's why we need more data literacy, if I'm to bring another perspective here again, across the departments, to understand what can or cannot be shared. But I would add that that is one of our biggest challenges at the moment.
Thank you, Amir. Great perspectives. And so I think we have time for one last question, which I'd like to now pose to the panelists. And I'd like us to kind of synthesize everything we've heard on this discussion and sort of bring our collective intellect to sort of a point of convergence now. So it's a very interesting question asked. It's received, it's the second highest votes here. But how do we develop a policy structure for AI? The speed of change seems too rapid to be playing catch up. What are the general principles, and how do we make them enforceable? So Carolyn, I'd like to start with you, is just to summarize a lot of the interesting things we've heard and your perspectives after hearing everything. How would we say we develop a good framework, a good policy structure for AI?
Well, it's interesting because the question, as you were reading out the question, had what I would have considered the answer in it. And I think the first thing is the principles. What exactly are we trying to do here? And part of it is fairness, and part of it is accountability. So where responsibilities, people have taken responsibilities to do things, how do we hold them accountable? So what are the principles for in Canada, so in the culture that we have, what are the principles going forward for how we deal with it? Because the specifics of any given regulation or any given policy have to implement the principles. And so I really truly think that that's where we have to start, and we have to stick with those principles kind of through thick and thin while we hold people accountable, and while we give out, we are more liberal and more agile with the way we use data, but we have to also figure out how to enforce compliance and or certification and or accountability.
Thank you, Carolyn. Ashley, I'd like to turn to you, your perspectives.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, this is the question that a bunch of us are trying to grapple with. And again, turning to what we did with the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems was exactly that. It was trying to take principles and put them into a directive. And I think one thing that's important is that throughout the process of implementation, you always, as Carolyn's saying, need to stay true to those principles. And so having continuous and ongoing reflection on those does become important. One thing I would say, though, is that it's easy to say, let's implement principles, but in reality, it's a very, very difficult task. And for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier, in that there's big differences in both the technology or the technologies that are used, but the technical understanding that people have and the perspectives that people have when they're going to implement these systems. And therefore, I think that it is actually really important that we do have a more complete suite of standards that are associated within these various different domains, so that we're actually defining what is it that we mean by fairness, what is it that we mean by bias, what is it that we mean by acceptability, or what's the acceptable threshold for explainability. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with this work. So I know I've mentioned the community portal and the map and the design assistant, but all of this is really culminating just so that we can build a certification mark. And so we are working on that. It is coming out soon, more information like in a week or so. In terms of what we're doing, we're partnering with the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto in these efforts. And they're really meant to then take all of the various different standards that are either applicable or in flight to actually continue to implement that desired state we'd like to see with those principles, as Carolyn was mentioning. And so I think that that's kind of key in how we move forward with this.
Thank you, Ashley. I'd like to turn to you, Amir, your perspectives on building a policy structure for AI.
Right. So I do agree with what Carolyn and Ashley said. We need to go back to the basics, to the core values of the government. We are here to serve the public. So in many contexts, the goal is not to come up with the most accurate model or most cost-efficient output. You have to keep in mind why we are producing these things. So we should not lose sight of that. It's easy to get into the weeds when you're doing the technical portion of it. So it's a trade of scientific things. So keeping things grounded and going back to the core values of the government, I think it's really, really essential. And then just having a one-size-fits-all might not work if you get too specific with these kind of policies. So you definitely want to have the explainability, being able to reason about the outputs, getting rid of bias as much as possible. So procuring data sets should have should be represented on these kind of policies. But beyond that, I don't think we should make it too specific. We should have those core values and then let each agency, each science department come up with its own guiding principles based on that would suit their mission, their type of data that they're working with, and have engagement from within their scientific teams to create these guiding principles, ensuring that privacy of Canadians is protected and it's an equitable, diversified solution and outputs for these models.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. And Giles, I'd like to conclude with your comments on this. Thank you.
Yeah, to me, it seems almost like developing new policies. You need to be synchronized with the most recent technological development because the technology is developing so rapidly. There may be some consequences that you don't foresee, a few months that you couldn't foresee a few months before. So you need to be, the policy people and the technical people almost have to be talking to each other on a regular basis to be able to develop policy that will last in the long run. If you don't do that, I think there will be unavoidable consequences that may come in.
Thank you, Giles, for your perspectives. So as we're coming up to the close of the session, I want to thank all the panelists. And as I had commented at the end of the prepared remarks, that we've taken this very interesting journey through this landscape of AI, where we've talked about sort of strategic concerns, we've talked about tactical operational issues, we talked about technology, talked on the functional side. But I think to summarize, we kind of came back to where we had started after covering a lot of ground, which is, as Ashley had mentioned, the importance of open data and open science as it relates to the success of AI. Carolyn had talked about sort of collaborative learning and knowledge sharing within communities of practice. Giles talked about the importance of collaborations, partnerships, and alliances. And then Amir had mentioned the importance of culture and leadership. And it's great that through this very interesting creative collision of ideas, we all have a better and a more elevated understanding of these topics. So with that, I know we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to close the session. I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time to join me, and I'd like to very much invite them back so that in a couple of months or the next year when CSPC happens, we can pick up this thread again and then sort of pick it up and see what has evolved in the 1 year delta, if you will. So thanks, Ashley, thanks, Carolyn, thanks, Giles, and thanks, Amir. And we'd like to close this with the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.